A great pleasure to welcome you to our dialogue on the second day. Before continuing, I will give the floor to the Secretariat to remind us about the use of the platform. Secretariat, you have the floor. Thank you, Co-Chair. Good morning, everyone. I wish just to remind you that if you wish to speak, please press the raise button at the bottom of your screen. It will turn yellow and your status will show as hand raised. Please do not press twice on this button, as this will put you at the end of the queue of the speakers list. We will be notified of your request in our queue system. The chair will invite you to speak. When it is your turn, you will see on your status bar microphone open and you press speak. And this will turn it red to live, which will also turn on your camera and microphone automatically. Please wait for 2 seconds and press with your intervention. When you're finished, please press the speak button again to turn off your live broadcast. Thank you. We will start with item 9 of the agenda, commemoration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous People. In 1994, the United Nations General Assembly decided that the International Day of the World's Indigenous People will be celebrated annually on the 9th of August. The date commemorates the first meeting of the United Nations Working Group of Indigenous Peoples, held in 1982. The theme for this year is Leaving No One Behind, Indigenous People and the Call for a New Social Contract. We have 3 speakers for this commemoration. I would like to invite first Ms. Elizabeth Maruma Monema, Executive Secretary of the Convention, to address the participants of this dialogue in the framework of International Days of Indigenous People. Ms. Maruma, you have the floor.
Our co-chair, Mr. Bazzini. Dear participants, it is with deep appreciation and respect that on behalf of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, I join you and all this commemoration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, observed yearly on the 9th of August. I see this commemoration as an opportunity to listen to and learn from the indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples remind us that we are all part of nature and that living with nature is part of our humanity. Their knowledge, wisdom, experiences provide solutions to the global environmental crisis. Indigenous knowledge helps us to understand nature from different perspectives, including assistance to monitor, map, and track the health of biodiversity. Although indigenous people constitute 6.2% of the world's population, they represent the most significant portion of global linguistics and cultural diversity. Indigenous people's livelihood depends on biodiversity. They cultivate a relationship with their land that intertwines daily practices and knowledge with spiritual values. This relationship nurtures both cultural and biological diversity. For example, indigenous people's food practices ensure sustainable use of biodiversity, while at the same time entrenching ethical values around the food. The bicultural approach teaches us that cultural and biological agendas are complementary. This knowledge and approach to ensuring biological and cultural diversity are fundamental today when we are facing a global biodiversity crisis. Indigenous peoples' experts' input and aspirations give us important direction on reimagining our relationship with our planet's future. At the local level, indigenous territories and lands are examples of efficient conservation areas for nature and culture. A bicultural approach offers possibilities of a much greater experiences of conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. This year's theme for the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, Leaving No One Behind, Indigenous Peoples and the call for a new social contract speaks directly to the heart of the convention and to the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. In a general sense, a social contract refers to written or unwritten agreements inspired by values which speak to all those it addresses. In many cases, such agreements detail the purpose and sequence of steps to meet shared values. Building a social contract involves listening to all involved to find points of common ground. Likewise, the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is a place of common ground where nature is valued by all. The 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook reports that most of the strategic plan for biodiversity 2011-2020 and the Aichi biodiversity targets have not been fully or completely met. The 2nd edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlook reports that the destruction of nature and the dramatic loss of biodiversity can be successfully reversed. Indigenous peoples' actions demonstrate how we can take decisive steps to protect nature. It is clear that many challenges remain to chart a new course for the decade ahead. Indigenous peoples' values, collective actions, and messages are central in this effort. The Secretariat on its side, together with the International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity, has organized 2 global thematic dialogues for Indigenous peoples and local communities on the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which were held in November 2019 and in December last year. The 3rd dialogue, Where We Are, serves as a further opportunity for the Indigenous peoples and local communities and parties to exchange views on the most recent draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in preparation for the 3rd meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Also, to support Indigenous peoples' engagement at the 3rd meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group, the Voluntary Trust Fund, which supports Indigenous peoples' participation in the convention's meetings, will support at least 1 to 2 representatives from each of the 7 Indigenous socio-cultural regions to ensure their full access to this upcoming online meeting. I presume those indications have already been made because the deadline for that, I believe, has already passed. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework proposes to set out a new social contract which aims to respond to the urgent call to protect nature. This is critical to lead us towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Achieving harmony requires reflecting all essential elements in a consistent and unified whole. Indigenous people's contribution and the social obligation these require are essential elements to ensure we can all live in harmony with nature, and that is the theme of this year's day. No one is left behind. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Gracias por su mensaje, señora Maruma.
Thank you for your statement, Ms. Maruma. Dear participants, we are pleased to have Mr. Francisco Calitzai, a UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People. Francisco Cali is a Cachiquel Maya from Guatemala. Mr. Cali, you have the floor. I invite you to press the raise your hand button and then press the speak button, please. I think that the Special Rapporteur is having them issues. We are not able to hear you. Could we ask then, please, Kapak? We also have our co-chair, Ms. Lucy Molenke of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. I will invite her to have the floor. Please press, Lucy, the raise your hand button and then speak. Please go share.
Mr. Francis Halley, Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, UN agencies, Indigenous people, and local communities, international organization, partners, and friends. Greetings and thank you for your time. For the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and the Indigenous Women and Biodiversity Network, it is our great pleasure to celebrate the International Day of the World's Indigenous People together. We are celebrating while in a crucial discussion of our third dialogue of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It is an opportunity to celebrate and acknowledge Indigenous peoples and local communities' contribution to protect nature and the need to increase efforts to recognize and ensure our collective rights on lands, territories, and waters which contain the most important biodiversity in the world. This year's theme, as we have already been told by Executive Director, leaving no one behind, Indigenous people, and the call for a new social contract. Currently, in the negotiation process of the adoption of the New Deal for Nature, the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we as Indigenous people and local communities continue calling upon the parties to the Convention, UN agencies, and all other partners in development not to leave us behind and have a new social contract. This is why we are here today, to discuss a process that we know, if completed and well implemented, it will make a lot of difference in helping us all to restore our ecosystems. Ladies and gentlemen, Indigenous people and local community, IGBE's Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has produced reports with a red flag on the deteriorating ecosystem and has given many reasons for that. More so, according to a recent report by UNEP and FAO, there has never been a more urgent need to revive damaged ecosystems than now. Ecosystems support all life on Earth. The healthier our ecosystems are, the healthier the planet and its people. Thus, the reason for having the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, which aims to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of the ecosystem on every continent. The decade is expected to help end poverty, combat climate change, and prevent the most extinction of our biological resources. But only remember this: if we have to succeed, we have all to work together, and this is why we are all working here to make sure the post-2020 global biodiversity succeeds. The report has the data that shows the fact that we are using the equivalent of 1.6 Earth service to maintain our current lifestyle. Yet, beyond the grim scale of current ecosystem degradation, the report also contains an inspiring truth. We are making progress on the conservation of ecosystems, and we have strategy for the coming decade for restoration on the needed scale. We are also told that there are now approximately 3.04 trillion trees on Earth. Trees on Earth. That is 46% fewer at the onset of agriculture, about 12 years ago. So you can see we still have a long way to go in order to be able to restore that ecosystem. And we need again to say we should not leave anyone behind, but work together. When we hear these figures and different reports, we get worried. But at the same time, I appreciate all of you here, and to you, my colleagues, for the hard work you have put in since the start of the formulation and discussion of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and all the support that we have had from the Secretariat and many other partners. We have to keep going. At the same time, Indigenous people have a lot to appreciate as we celebrate this particular day. We are happy because we have a better voice than before. We have recognition than before. But still, we have a long way to go before our rights are fully respected and recognized. Let us continue working collectively together, making sure that we take the outcomes of this discussion we are having here to our regions and to our local levels, that we still work all of us together and not leave anybody behind. A human rights approach is important because we know Indigenous people and local communities are partners to establish the relationship between peoples and nature and play a vital role in biodiversity management. We have great hope that the dialogue in the negotiation process of the New Deal for Nature is a characteristic of the process of leave no one behind, making sure Indigenous people, local communities, women and youth will fully and effectively participate in the process. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone.
Gracias, señora copresidenta Lucy, agradecemos por esas palabras. Tenemos nuevamente al relator, creo que tuvo algunas dificultades de conexión, pero está...
We had some issues on connectivities, but now we have the special rapporteur with us. So now we will give the floor to the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people, Mr. Francisco Cali. Ecachel Mayan from Guatemala. Please raise your hand button and then press the speak button. You have the floor. Can you hear me? Yes, we do. I would like to thank the opportunity for sharing some thoughts with you today. To all participants of this third Thematic dialogue on Indigenous people. Today I would like to provide 3 key messages in the construction towards the Agenda of D30 and the participation of Indigenous peoples. There are some issues with the sound of the special rapporteur. When the United Nations system has started handling with this specific approach in the 80s, after the adoption of the Indigenous people's rights, and thanks to that struggle, the Indigenous rights were recognized within the UN framework. As a special rapporteur, he received information on human rights violations. This new framework is a great opportunity to ensure that those human rights of Indigenous people are defended. Indigenous people represent different cultures and diversity.
So the debate lately was centered in the fact that indigenous peoples have to preserve and conserve their different societies, their
Ces modes de vie, ce sont
Dicho sea de paso, se encuentran principalmente en los territorios de los pueblos indígenas. Ellos han demostrado ser verdaderos protectores de la naturaleza, pero su defensa los ha puesto bajo ataques.
We have been the ones that have protected the land. So all the policies and conservation plans without a human rights approach will have a negative approach for indigenous peoples. So we need to consider indigenous peoples as strategic partners. That means, well, it is necessary to consider indigenous peoples as strategic partners, to acknowledge their contributions and use their strategies for the biodiversity conservation, and also have them access for projects of conservation and give them more support for conservation of biodiversity. And lastly, human rights are not against the efforts to preserve and sustain nature. All indigenous peoples are allies to protect nature. That means to respect and to support local actions of indigenous peoples in favor of conservation. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude expressing my gratitude for the opportunity that I have to speak to you and to wish a great International Day to Indigenous peoples. Thank you, Mr. Rapporteur. It's really important. It's really an honor to have you here in this dialogue, and especially in the within the framework of the indigenous peoples. So I would like to invite the Secretariat to show us a video of indigenous peoples. Bien, se ha preparado un pequeño video. Bien, los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales representan solamente 5% de la población global, protegen alrededor del 80% de la biodiversidad de la Tierra. Los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales están al frente de los esfuerzos de conservación, pero están afectados de manera desproporcional por lo que está sucediendo. Para proteger la tierra hace falta la protección plena y efectiva de todos los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales. Es tiempo de escuchar, es tiempo de hablar y es tiempo de actuar de manera colectiva para la naturaleza. Hay que también...
The Nagoya Protocol, a supplementary agreement to the Convention on Biological Diversity, is an opportunity to mainstream and integrate Indigenous peoples' rights. This agreement highlights the invaluable knowledge and natural resource stewardship of Indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as the importance of prior informed consent and fair and equitable benefit sharing. Living in harmony with nature is possible and necessary. Indigenous peoples and local communities have been doing it for millennia. It is time to truly listen to them. Learn more at www.cbd.int/traditional.
Gracias, Secretaría. Creo que...
Thank you, Secretariat. I think this dialogue is taking place within the framework of the International Day of Indigenous Peoples, and this is important. But after this commemoration, I would like to welcome all the indigenous peoples and the parties that are here. And let's start with item 6 of the agenda, which is the contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities, lands, territories, and waters, area-based conservation targets in the first draft of Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So we invited Ms. Rita Zagul, Costa Rica, and Adèle Fardout from France, from the High Ambition Coalition. So please press the raise your hand button and then press the speak button once it turns blue. So please go ahead. You have the floor. Thank you. Can you hear us? Yes? Well, thank you. Thank you for having us here. I will give first the floor to Adèle, my colleague who will be making the presentation. And can we share the screen, please? Thank you.
I will now start our presentation. So, Excellencies, dear participants and colleagues, so my name is Adèle and I work at the French Ministry of Environment. And as was stated, I will be making my presentation with my colleague Rita, who works for Costa Rica's Ministry of Environment. And together we coordinate the Secretariat of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. Let me first thank the organizers for inviting us today, and it is a great honor for us to be making our presentation on the occasion of the International Day of the World's Indigenous People. So to start, I would like to briefly introduce the coalition. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the High Ambition Coalition was founded in December 2019, and it's an intergovernmental and interregional group of countries who champion the goal of protecting 30% of the land and 30% of the sea by 2030. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, defending these protection targets that we find necessary and aligned with science is our first and main goal. And what we want is that it's adopted within the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that is to be adopted at the COP15 later. This goal for us, it's not only about quantity, it's also about quality. And that's why we also advocate that the 30% targets should promote indigenous-led conservation, prioritize intact ecosystems, and focus on areas that are most important for biodiversity and climate. We also defend the fact that the network of protected areas should be well connected, ecologically representative, and maintain species diversity and abundance. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I said, our main goal is the 30 by 30 target, but we also have additional goals that we defend that we believe will create the enabling conditions for the targets to be well implemented. So as stated first, we have a lot of emphasis on the effective management of protected and conserved areas. Our second additional goal is also the fact that we are discussing how to increase public and private financing to ensure that we have the means to implement well the targets and that we have long-term management of protected areas and local governance. We also champion to have clear implementation and a robust implementation mechanism in order for the targets to be rapidly translated on the ground and to put nature on the path to recovery by 2030. And finally, our fourth goal is to increase the synergies between climate and biodiversity by showing that protected areas and OECMs are also efficient tools to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. So this is why we are engaging with the CDB COP15, but we also try to engage within the UNFCCC COP26. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Adèle. And as Adèle was mentioning, the coalition supports the 30 by 30 target being achieved with the inclusion, participation, and partnership of Indigenous people and local communities. Nonetheless, we were aware of the concern that many expressed from IPLCs and organization on the 30 by 30 when we started our work. And this is why we created a task force on IPLC. It was actually the first task force that we created within the coalition. And the task force was formed by Canada, Colombia, Mozambique, Chile, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Norway, Australia, the UK, and of course, France and Costa Rica. And the main idea with this task force was to listen to and work on IPLC concerns related to 30 by 30 target, because as was mentioned, our main idea is to really ensure that there's this constant conversation and making IPLC as crucial and central partners in this implementation of the 30 by 30 target. We are very grateful to the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, to the IAFB, with whom we have been in dialogue since February, as well as at national level. Many of the task force members have been having dialogue at a national level with Indigenous people and local communities to precisely develop a narrative and discuss potential options for the global biodiversity framework on Target 3 now and on indicators. So we have been constructing this dialogue, and we are very, very grateful for the IAFB because we have been working together since February, and we have been meeting actually on almost a monthly basis since then. Our goal is to ensure that the IPLC are fully engaged and included in the discussion of the 30 by 30 target in order to really make this target beneficial to both nature and IPLCs. Next slide, please. Thank you. Going back to the task force and the narrative of the task force, this is basically a document that we're co-created also with the IAFB, as was mentioned, and we very recently finalized this document. This document will be shared on the Hack for Nature and People's website. I will put in the chat box the link for that. We will be sharing it next week, hopefully. But we wanted to share with you some of the main messages that the task force came up with. And mainly what we wanted to share with you is that the task force reflect to the fact that we need to secure that the adoption of the 30 by 30 target in the GBF is seen as an opportunity to implement the commitments made under the UN Declaration for Rights of the Indigenous Peoples, and to ensure an innovative approach to conservation that respects Indigenous rights and responsibility and respects the rights of humans and nature. Also, one of the other main messages is to make sure that the designation of protected areas and identifications of OECMs is undertaken with free, prior, and informed consent of IPLCs. The idea now with the task force is to continue our work and dialogue with IAFB and others, and to maintain the dialogue on Target 3 and its indicators in the run-up to COP15. We understand that beyond Target 3, there are other targets that are very important for IPLCs, but we as a coalition have been mainly focused on this target as it is the one of 30 by 30, as was mentioned by my colleague Adele. But we really look forward to continue this open discussion and to exchange our views in the run-up to COP15 and make sure that this is an inclusive process as well from our side. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much. So to finish this presentation, we wanted to give you a brief overview of what we plan in 2021 and also a little bit in 2022. So in the hack, we propose 2 tracks of engagement. We involve in a high-level engagement tracks where we showcase political messages, and we wish to involve our ministers to be sure that our higher level, even at the heads of states level, are involved and are working on the 30 by 30 targets. And we also engage more at the technical level with the experts, the negotiators, the scientists, the CDB focal point, etc. So we do both work in a parallel track. When it comes to the high level engagement, although the coalition was initiated in December 2019, we were officially launched at the One Planet Summit in January 2021. During this year, we also involved within the G7 and G20 environment communique and environment ministerials in order to keep momentum on the 30 by 30 targets, also in these areas of negotiations. Third, so the open-ended working group 3 will open later this month And we are very happy that there is a dedicated space for the coalition to promote its messages during the ministerial segment of the meeting. So we will also be represented at that meeting. And also, very shortly after the Open-Ended Working Group 3 meeting, we have the IUCN World Congress that will open from the 3rd to the 11th of September and will be in a hybrid format with in-person in Marseille and also a virtual setup. And the the High Ambition Coalition will host some events, and mostly with the IUCN, we organize a high-level dialogue on the 30 by 30 on the 5th of September.
Thank you, Adele. Then during UNGA, just moving quickly, we will have a high-level event on a leaders level, heads of state and heads of government. We will, of course, invite also an IPLC representative during that meeting. And of course, we will engage at the highest level during the CBD COP15 and the UNFCCC COP26. And with regards to the technical level, we have been, as I mentioned before, meeting on a monthly basis with the HAC members, but also as we have two task forces, one on IPLC and the other one on SABSA, we also meet at a monthly basis. Just wanted to also share with you that all the work that we also have been doing within the IPLC task force is also reflected in our work in the other task force as well. So whenever we have created some kind of common position or common general recommendations that we have given to the HAC members, it's also fed in from the information that we have achieved within the IPLC task force. Then, of course, we will continue this engagement on a technical level during the open-ended working group and, of course, during the COP15. Next, please. Just to finalize, we wanted to open the invitation for colleagues to contact me and contact Adele. And to really, and I will write our contact in the chat box as well. We really want to have an open and very sincere dialogue with everyone who wishes to do so. We are again very grateful for the invitation, and we are very delighted to be working with IFB. We are very excited to continue our work with you, and so we wanted to really thank you once again for having us today, and we will look forward for the interactive segment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gracias por su presentación.
Thank you for your presentation and the dialogue with indigenous peoples, mainly with the IIFB. It's of great happiness because we want to foster really to acknowledge the contribution of indigenous peoples, lands, and territories. They can contribute with the global framework. I would like to invite Mr. Greenbean to make a brief presentation of the topic. Ben Green, please, from the Assembly of the First Nations.
Thank you and welcome everyone. So the purpose of this presentation, next slide please, is to review the text of targets 1 to 3, summarize IFB's initial analysis of these targets from the dialogue this week, and to suggest some amendments to the text. Next slide, please. So target 1 aims to ensure that all land and sea areas globally are under integrated biodiversity inclusive spatial planning, addressing land and sea use change, retaining existing and intact wilderness areas. Next slide, please. We reflected how this target covers all ecosystems and land use categories, including those of indigenous peoples and local communities, our lands, territories, and waters, and how these territories must be considered a distinct land use category in spatial planning. We reflected that land use change is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss, and that COP has adopted a traditional knowledge indicator which includes land use change on the territories of indigenous peoples and local communities, and that we would like to see this included here. We reflected that indigenous peoples' land contains the majority of these so-called wilderness and intact areas with low-level human impacts, and that these contain the majority of the world's remaining biodiversity. However, the term wilderness is not an accurate description because it fails to recognize that these lands have a human interface and ongoing human interaction. We reflected that any sort of spatial planning and conservation efforts need to include Indigenous peoples and local communities who occupy their territories. That this spatial planning cannot result in the displacement or criminalization of Indigenous peoples and local communities who promote conservation. And that this, in fact, presents an opportunity to promote living in harmony with nature by integrating science and traditional knowledge and respecting Indigenous peoples' own spatial planning. We reflected also that it's not clear whether this target includes marine, coastal, and freshwater areas as well, and that it should have language more consistent with Target 2 in this regard. So next slide, please. Our proposed amendments to the text are to include freshwater areas and to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities over their lands, territories, waters, and resources. Next slide, please. All right, so Target 2 aims to ensure that at least 20% of degraded freshwater, marine, and terrestrial ecosystems come under restoration, in ensuring that connectivity among them and focusing on priority ecosystems. Next slide, please. Our reflections on this target included that restoration is actually a priority among Indigenous peoples and local communities, complementary to conservation and customary sustainable use. And that in order for Indigenous restoration to occur, we require secure customary land tenure and control and management over our lands and our restoration activities. Many IPLCs are facing external threats which are degrading and damaging their territories. And to help mitigate this, we need secure land tenure and management to ensure that this damage does not happen. Indigenous peoples' territories are often the key biodiversity areas, and this has been outlined in IPBES, and we know that we will definitely be impacted greatly by this target. Restoration action needs to be inclusive of Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge, innovations, practices, and technologies obtained with their free, prior, and informed consent in order to avoid any unintended negative consequences for biodiversity and people. And this is very important. So our text amendments here are to ensure that, next slide, please, that this target enables and supports the restoration initiatives of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Next slide, please. Target 3 aims to ensure that at least 30% globally of land and sea areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and its contributions to people, are conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative, and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, and integrated into wider land and seascapes. Next slide, please. We've reflected that regardless of the percent in this target, it's important to take into account not only a quantitative but qualitative evaluation of conservation. Indigenous peoples' lands and territories and waters already cover at least 25% of global area, but only 10% of this is legally recognized. Regarding biodiversity's contribution to people, we're concerned about this language and how it seems extractive. It's important to maintain a reciprocal relationship between nature and people. This is the foundation of an equitable and balanced management of biodiversity. There's a need to stress that people need to contribute to biodiversity conservation in order for biodiversity to contribute to people. Most of the biodiversity of remaining on this planet is found on the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples. And this is already evidence enough of effective management of biodiversity. And so when we see the word equitably included in this target, we need to ensure that Indigenous peoples' management and governance is recognized in this as well. And this must be a rights-based approach. Next slide, please. We reflected how Indigenous peoples' lands, territories, and waters are more than and distinct from protected areas and or OECNs, and how we cannot be confined to these two categories. We do not want to see all of our lands and territories fall under conservation measures. There is a need to ensure that Indigenous land, territories, and waters have a distinct recognition, taking into account that some Indigenous lands, territories, and waters can be conserved areas or protected areas or OECMs if there is FPIC. IPLCs who have traditionally governed and conserved their lands and waters need to be appropriately recognized and collectively secure. Conservation, customary use, and benefit sharing all need to be considered in Indigenous area-based conservation, whatever form it takes. And this needs to be reflected in a rights-based approach inclusive of free, prior, and informed consent. We also recognize that appropriate financial resourcing will be required to secure and ensure that this target not only establishes protected areas or conservation areas, but are available to ensure that they are perpetually able to operate. And so, next slide, please. Our text proposals include adding, in addition to equitably managed, governed and managed, and to ensure that these areas are developed with the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including through appropriate recognition and support for their collective lands, territories, resources of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Thank you.
Gracias por la presentación, Ben. Gracias.
Thank you, Ben, for your presentation. Before we open to plenary, I would like to remind you that the interventions should be kept to a maximum duration of 3 minutes. I would like to thank the participants who have provided statements in the session yesterday. In order to ensure that these sessions are as open as possible to all participants, we invite those who did not have the opportunity to speak yesterday to request the floor now. Please press the raise your hand button to request the floor. I know that we're getting used to this new platform for some of us, but we will invite all participants that would like to share their comments and ideas on the presentations. In this specific case, the presentation of Ben, I think that we have been going through a thorough analysis, and I see Iran. Please, Iran, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your presentation and the comments for the targets that has been provided by colleagues. I would like to add add something to the text that has been suggested by colleagues to be consistent with Indigenous people and local communities, because I saw in some suggestion has just written Indigenous peoples, but it would be better to use the language of Indigenous people and local communities. And the second issue is that in many countries, land has been nationalized, and they are under the governance of states, governments. So in these conditions, we need to use the
Sí, no le escuchamos.
We can't hear you. I think we lost a connection.
Y gracias también por las.
Thank you for that brief comment. I think it was quite interesting. We will try to wait some minutes to see whether he can reconnect to provide the floor to him again. But I do not see further hands raised, but I will invite you again to raise your hand to share your comments, since it is important for Indigenous peoples and local communities to hear also your ideas on our proposals based on the hard work we had. Canada is raising her hand. Canada, please. You have the floor.
Morning. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the presentations that took place this morning. Canada is a member, as our colleagues from the HAC Secretariat mentioned, is a member of the HAC, the High Ambition Coalition, and the High Ambition Coalition's IPLC task force. And so we're particularly happy to be able to participate in today's discussion that's focused more specifically on targets, 1, 2, and 3, and the target on protected areas. And so we're eager to hear, very much appreciate the opportunity to hear the views and suggestions of IPLCs with regards to target wording. We note the appreciation in particular of colleagues from IIFB and the HAC's task force work, and also wanted to express our openness to include other individuals who might have an interest in commenting and or engaging on the work of the High Ambition Coalition's task force on for IPLCs. And so would welcome, just maybe invite anyone who has an interest in also kind of participating and commenting and engaging on the work of the task force to, and I can post my email information in the chat to reach out, and we'd be happy to include other individuals in our kind of future engagement work. I'd also certainly welcome and invite participants that would like to do so to share the experiences, examples that they might have had in their working together with IPLCs or as IPLCs themselves on protected area systems, achieving the important conservation of biodiversity results, whilst also ensuring IPLC rights are safeguarded in accordance with, relevant legislation. And so if there are examples of individuals if there are examples that participants would like to share on the work that's been going on, that would be very useful moving forward for the work of the task force in terms of potential examples of win-win situations that can be shared and used to promote the work of the task force. So maybe I'll end there because I think I've already had 3 minutes. Thank you.
Agradecemos a la delegada de Canadá por...
Thank you to the Canadian delegate for the observations, for the invitation to participate in the HAC working group to open dialogue venues to focus on Indigenous peoples and local communities work, examples and supports that will help us also provide support biodiversity within the framework of a human rights approach. I will now give the floor to the other participants that would like to intervene in this specific section. I know that sometimes it is hard to deal with the new technologies. I've been receiving some internal messages on this regard, but it is interesting to be part of this dialogue, to intervene, to exchange ideas and opinions that will make us create a better understanding and a better analysis to move forward with the different targets within the framework post-2020. Mexico has the floor. Please, Mexico. Thank you, Co-Chair. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you today, reviewing these specific targets with the concern and on the specific issues related to local communities and Indigenous people. For Mexico, this is also a priority topic in our internal discussions. Mexico, we believe that it is aligned with what we have already been sharing throughout this meeting. So we are always supporting the free, prior, informed consent. And we believe it's important to mention that we are also part of the coalition 30 by 30. So we do believe this is an important addition to this text. We believe it is important to recognize the collective land, territories, and resources are also quite important to be highlighted. So this proposal, we believe, could be quite useful as part of the negotiations, and that's something that we would just wanted to highlight to all of you. Thank you, Mexico. Thank you for your support, for your comments in opinion. We have IPLC International India. Please, you have the floor.
Le escuchamos. Adelante. Adelante.
Yes, please. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias. On behalf of the International Indian Treaty Council, or Consejo de Tratados Indios, CITI, we would like to express some concerns about free, prior, and informed consent, first of all, just to ensure that the leaders of those communities are the ones that are engaged, and that FPIC is not used as a channel to go around any traditional authorities. Based on the right to self-determination affirmed in both Article 3 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Article 1 in common with the UN Human Rights Conventions, Indigenous peoples have the rights to decide for themselves if their traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise acquired lands or resources will be designated as protected areas. Such Indigenous peoples' protected areas should be accompanied by the full and unqualified legal recognition of their land tenure and title as affirmed in Article 26, Paragraph 3, and Article 37 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And finally, we'd just like to ensure that adequate and equitable funding for the administration and maintenance of Indigenous peoples' protected areas will be provided to the relevant Indigenous peoples, taking into account commitments once again in Article 41 of the UN Declaration. We hope to further engage and also join this task force and make some connections between the UNFCCC, a facilitative working group who is also working on these issues in preparation for COP26. Thank you.
Agradecemos por los comentarios, por las observaciones.
Thank you for your comments, your observations. I think those were quite important and key to be considered at this specific time. Now we will give the floor to Gabriel Filac. Please, Filac, go ahead. Thank you, Ramiro. Thank you for giving me the floor. Greetings to all participants in this working session and this third dialogue. And greetings to Ben, and thanks for your proposal. Ben, as FILAC is a Territory Ibero-American agency. We would like to call the attention again to this specific topic. No proposal should tend to go backward. We need to look at all the progress that we have achieved in the past 30 years. All different collectives and groups have been working hard for the efforts to the approved UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights that we were recalling. We were recalled by the special rapporteur today. We believe that this proposal specifically, in accordance with Target 3, is key. it is fundamental since it does not only help us to strengthen what we have been already saying in Article 25 of the UN Declaration. It also conveys all the different recommendations of Indigenous Forum, the Permanent Forum last session on April. So with due respect to all different parties, we would like to ask not to move forward, but forward, and to keep on emphasizing to have a complete, full, comprehensive vision that includes all the different factors that are part of Indigenous people. The way of life, the cosmovision, I think Ben's proposal has been quite accurate and adjusting Target 3 as it is presented in the screen. Thank you, Ramiro, co-chair. Thank you for that.
Thank you for the intervention of the Indigenous Fund. So we will give the floor now to Solidar. Please, Solidar, go ahead. You have the floor. So I represent fishers of small scale from Latin America, and we believe it is essential that within the topics, all those global associations that are working in this sector also need to be consulted and informed in a transparent way. So for these initiatives, mainly territories that are in coastal areas, in mangroves areas. So the proposal and the integral way of seeing things has to take into account all the sectors, mainly now that things have changed. And it is important now to make some to take care of the sea. So we need to, I'm asking to the respect of the community of fishers, of small scale fishers of the world. So they need to consult to make sure that these people, in many cases, well, they don't have the right to fish consolidated. So they also have knowledge in this area. So thank you very much. Thank you for taking the floor. I don't know if somebody else wishes to take the floor. We would like to encourage the parts to take the floor and also indigenous peoples to take the floor. Mexico, Valeria Cruz is asking for the floor. So Valeria, yes, thank you very much, Dr. Ramiro. We would like to say, since all the topic was reviewed, all the proposal, what we would like is to make a proposal for you if you believe this is relevant. So after importance for biodiversity, to include cultural diversity, because there is a link, the presence of a high density of biodiversity and also high cultural biodiversity. And this is a biocultural dynamic of indigenous peoples for conservation and diversification of species. And we can mention that maybe you know better than we do because you have a lot of experience. When we lose an indigenous language, we lose the connection with the way we name some species. And this is very delicate. So this is our proposal for you, and we hope it will be welcomed. Thank you, Mexico. we are going to write down the comments and this concrete proposal to integrate it. We know, we have a team that is making all the analysis and writing down, and we'll take into account all these so that we can make progress. So the floor is still open for the parties or the brothers and sisters that wish to take the floor. This is the moment to make the comments of such a basic topic. We have India. India, please go ahead.
Creo que la conexión está un poco...
I think we don't have a good connection. We cannot hear. Okay.
Thank you very much for this time, and thank you everyone who has spoken before. Please excuse me. This is the first time I'm participating in an international platform like this, but I'll try and keep to what has been the sentiments of what have been expressed. I represent the indigenous communities of Northeast India. This is lies mainly on the Indo-Myanmar border, and we have been talking a lot about the traditional knowledge and how important it is that traditional knowledge is preserved, conserved, and also used. One of the main challenges that we have here is that traditional knowledge is constantly changing, and with the pressure of globalization, traditional knowledge is in fact what we are witnessing here with the next generation is the depleting connectivity with the land and with the traditional systems of land holding or relationship with land, forest, and water. So even the adults today, the existing adult population, there is just a small percentage of people who have real knowledge about the traditional systems, and I feel that there is a great need to reconnect the people, the indigenous people of these areas, to their land, the youth of this land to their land and to their systems and to the wisdom of the ancestors, so that by this way, when we know what we have, we can protect and we can be proud of what we have. One of the great examples that have happened in the recent times in some places is that there have been concerted efforts by groups to formulate local biodiversity reports of the local areas, and this has greatly helped for communities to come forward to protect what they have. So in the end, I just want to stress that while we talk about the traditional knowledge and the importance of traditional knowledge and preserving and conserving these systems for the future and for the survival of this planet, I also want to make a point to stress that we must educate and we must, whatever we do, we are conscious that we are passing on this knowledge to the next generation. Thank you very much for your time.
Gracias, agradecemos bastante por eso.
Thank you very much for the comments and observations that support the proposal we have here. Now we have IPLC, Checho, and then Donald Rojas. Please go ahead, John. No, we don't hear him. John, go ahead. You have the floor. Co-chair, I think we lost John. Yes. So now let's give the floor to Donald Rojas from Costa Rica. Please, Donald, go ahead. Mr. Donald, in the upper left part, you will find the mic. You have to click on the mic, and then you will select the mic you are going to use now. Yes, good morning. First of all, I would like to thank and congratulate all of you because of the International Day of Indigenous Peoples. And I would like to thank the presentation of the group of a high ambition coalition, mainly the dialogues with indigenous peoples. The dialogues are very important because that allows us to move forward and to make some progress regarding human rights and indigenous peoples. So this is the topic today, the territories. This is essential because for indigenous peoples are holistic systems and not only have areas where they live today, but also are the areas as ancestral areas with preserved public or not. So I would like to give you a couple of examples. In the case of Costa Rica, we have included in the specific targets on biodiversity on how to make some progress in this respect with the state and the indigenous communities in these areas, and so that we will be able to use traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples to use not only land areas, but also marine areas, so that we can include all the traditional knowledge that have a direct impact with the communities. So this is being done with this consultation and also with the free, prior, and informed consent. So these are examples that are helping the parties to preserve the resources, but also it's a guarantee that all the indigenous knowledges are going to be sustainable in the future. So I invite the parties not to be afraid of this type of dialogues and not to go backwards. We have made some progress regarding conservation and to improve things. So we have this 30%. Even for indigenous peoples, it can be even more, a bigger target than the one we have now. But if we have a consensus to move forward, to make some consultations and to respecting the work that is being done, I think it is very important. So I would like to congratulate the parties for the progress, and please let's not go back. Thank you. Thank you, Donald, for your comments. It is important to see the examples that show how indigenous peoples were able to preserve and to contribute with biodiversity. So next speaker, John.
Sí, te escuchamos, John.
Thank you very much, Remio. I just wanted to, for IPLC, I guess perspective is that what's being presented here in these three targets is an example of the potential for transformative change. I think part of the things that we've been talking about for a very long time as IPLCs is trying to educate and make people aware about these issues that come from indigenous communities and how it differs slightly in perspective, but trying to make awareness become a part of the process. I think part of the transformative change that the global biodiversity framework is talking about is not just in terms of economics and other issues in terms of development and whatnot, but also to educate people, to raise that awareness and to change and transform those relationships between indigenous peoples, non-indigenous peoples, between with the public as well, to understand a greater degree of how indigenous peoples perceive and know the natural world. And it's a part of this process here. It's not so much a political debate or an adversarial process or whatnot. We're looking here that we're going to be looking at the same goals. There's different approaches, and I think there should be room for that. And I think that raising that awareness through communications with the public, with the governments and policy decision makers is a part of this. And I'm hoping that the transformative process is about raising awareness of indigenous perspectives and how important that is in these processes. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos a John.
We really would like to thank John for the comments and for the suggestions. This is very important to be taken into account. So I would like to give the floor now to our brother Ben so he can make some comments for the closure. Ben, please go ahead. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think that John's point is very important and that we should take a moment here to maybe reflect on the request of Canada yesterday as well, to think about how we can make these targets more cross-cutting and how a rights-based approach can become more cross-cutting, and to recognize the holistic approach of Indigenous peoples to conservation in these targets. And to recognize that by recognizing Indigenous spatial planning, Indigenous conservation, and Indigenous restoration actions, we can look at things outside of isolation. So, for example, an Indigenous agriculture project or practice might help to reduce the use of pesticides. It can help reduce the introduction and proliferation of invasive species. It can help promote food security. It can help sequester carbon with cover crops and agroforestry practices. It helps support the mainstreaming of biodiversity practices by developing that science policy, but science Indigenous knowledge interface as well. And that this really is an opportunity to move beyond just different targets within the GBF, but also to help promote advancement on SDGs and work in other conventions as well. So that's my reflection here. Thank you.
Gracias, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. We have Colombia who is asking the floor. So before closing the topic, so Colombia, you have the floor. Go ahead. Thank you. Good morning or good evening or good afternoon to everyone. We would like to thank from Colombia all the words that were here presented by different communities and Indigenous peoples and other delegates. So briefly, we would like to mention the work we are doing here in Colombia. We are really grateful for the presentation made by the High Ambition Coalition, and we wanted to highlight something very particular of the things we were thinking about Target 3 related to the work we do in Colombia. We acknowledge the work and all the relationship with IPLCs and all the links between protected areas and Indigenous peoples. We have 24% of protected areas with territories, in Indigenous territories, and 65% of protected areas of national parks are related with, it's 24%, or next to it, or they coincide. So that's why we have a policy of social policy where we have agreements with Indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombian communities and people rural that live in the rural areas. So we have special regimes where we agree with the community's objectives for conservation and the way they manage protected areas. We have nice examples like the park Yapaporis, who was created. It was asked by Indigenous communities to protect their area. So we have a special regime for them. So we believe that Indigenous peoples and local communities are very important actors. And therefore, we have developed actions like these ones for conservation with the peoples and built jointly. It's not only like a socializing exercise, but something that we build together, like, for example, the plan to manage a natural part of Sierra Nevada and Tayrona with four peoples of Sierra Nevada in Santa Marta. And in this sense, we are really monitoring the indicators of Target 3 to highlight the importance of the governance, the shared governance with indigenous peoples and local communities, and to be able to have more clear this equitable management from the protected areas in order to contribute with conservation of territories of indigenous communities, so that the communities will be able to live in their own territory and being protected in all the senses, respecting as well their rights. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Colombia. What you have mentioned, it is important to see those links and dialogues and things that are happening in different countries, because that makes us stronger to make progress and to be able to talk to the parties and the ones that are here, that are supporting, and they can see what we are doing as indigenous peoples, and also to make them, to appropriate them. So it's going to be important in the working group. So dear colleagues, we are going to have a 15-minute break. It's, excuse me, I'm in the Guatemalan schedule. We will come back at 9:35 Montreal time. So please don't close your connection. We will see you in 15 minutes.
Yes, now we are able to hear you properly. Dear colleagues, welcome back. We will now proceed with agenda item 7, participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the first draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now I want to invite Ms. Abigail Kitma, part of the TEDVA Foundation, to make a brief presentation on the participation and the framework. Please, Abigail, you have the floor now.
Okay. All right. Is my audio good? Okay. Thank you. So, good day to everyone. I'm Abby Kitma, and I'm joining everyone from Baguio City, the part of the land of the Ibaloy Indigenous peoples here in the Philippines. So, for this session, we'll be focusing on Target 21 on participation. So, next slide, please. So, basically, IFB's proposal for get pretty straightforward. We don't have a proposed textual changes. What's happened? Oh no. Hello?
Hello. Now we can hear you.
Sound good. All right. I hope my connection is not fluctuating, but basically we have no proposed textual changes. But what we want to emphasize is that this target is very relevant for Indigenous peoples. It's cross-cutting, and we want that the important components and elements of this target be strengthened and not weakened throughout the negotiations for this post-2020 framework. So we see two major components that are very relevant, the one on participation and the other on the respect for our rights over land, territories, and resources. So we hope that these components are carried over throughout the final adoption of the framework, as we see them as very relevant in the implementation of the framework. So we'd just like to emphasize a few of our discussions or analysis in the IFB. So next slide, please. So on equitable and effective participation, we welcome that there is an effort to address the unequal power relations when it comes to decision making, and when it's related to our territories and resources. We want to emphasize that Indigenous peoples, local communities should be regarded as rights holders and not just as stakeholders in these processes. We welcome that it has a broad inclusion of women, girls, and youth, as well as those in Indigenous peoples and local communities. We take biodiversity decision-making as something that's general and inclusive, so not just participation in the convention meetings, but also participation in the whole process of the NBSAPs, as well as in environmental governance. So this also shows how it is cross-cutting with other targets, because this would mean that in Target 1 on spatial planning, when it touches on Indigenous territories, then it's important that the full and equitable and effective participation of Indigenous peoples should be implemented or emphasized. Also, yesterday it was reiterated that this is especially important as well for Target 20. Next slide, please. So on the other component, on the respect for rights over land, territories, and resources, we acknowledge and welcome that this target references language and our right as stipulated in the UN TRIP. And therefore, we see that this has cross-cutting relevance in all the targets where our contributions as Indigenous peoples are very important, such as in the conservation targets, as explained by our by our brother Ben a while ago. It's also very important for customary sustainable use targets, as explained yesterday by our sister Georgie, and as well as in access and benefit sharing and traditional knowledge. So we've heard a lot yesterday and also a while ago the importance of the right to FPIC of Indigenous peoples when it comes to our lands, territories, and resources. We also note that the theory of change and in the enabling conditions, rights-based approaches are mentioned. And we see that this is an important opportunity to for the post-2020 framework to also align itself with human rights guidance and the human rights-based approach. Next slide, please. So given that there are these important elements in this target that we want to see carried through the adoption of the framework, what is important now is to ensure the correct implementation of this target, and that the intention for this target is recognized and done when we implement the post-2020 framework. So some points or gaps that the members of the IFB have also noticed that would help in ensuring that Target 21 is properly understood or properly made cross-cutting in the framework is that first, the issue of human rights violations in relation to in the name of conservation should be addressed, and in particular the accountability and as well as access to justice for Indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, and environmental human rights defenders. In relation to equitable participation, there is also need to recognize the importance of rights to access to information, or equitable access to information. It's also important that when we talk about rights over land, territories, resources, that the recognition of Indigenous waters should also be there. We also take note that the respect for traditional knowledge, as it was stated in or referent as it was an element in Aichi Biodiversity Target 18, is not that well reflected, but we do note that traditional knowledge has been mainstreamed in the framework. So maybe there's still ways more so that this could be better reflected. And we'd also like to emphasize that there are traditional knowledge indicators adopted in Decision 1043 that could help better implement this in the framework. So another point is that many Indigenous peoples really wanted to reiterate that the importance of Indigenous peoples in monitoring and in NBSAPs. So I think this is also a callback to further recognition of community-based monitoring information systems and recognizing contributions of Indigenous peoples and our to biodiversity through our local collective actions, among other things. So that's the major points of we would like to share for the discussion of the group for Target 21 on participation. So maybe in the last slide, just to can we go to the next slides? I've incorporated the key messages. So just to reflect the people who worked on the discussion. In the last slide, please. So many thanks for the group who worked on this, as well as with the IFB caucus, was extensively discussed and reviewed Target 21. So thank you.
Gracias, Avi, por la presentación.
Thank you, Abby, for your presentation. Thank you for sharing the analysis and reflections of the group. Before opening the plenary session, I would like to remind you the interventions have a maximum duration of 3 minutes. I just want to thank the participants who have provided statements in this session. And in order to ensure that the sessions are as open as possible to all participants, we invite those who did not have the opportunity to speak yesterday to request the floor now. Indigenous people representatives, state representatives, and observers are more than welcome to request the floor. So a call to all participants to go through a thorough analysis and discussion on these proposals. The floor is open. Benito Calixto from Kaoi, from the Abya, the southern parts of Abya in South America. Benito, please. You have the floor. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you, depending on where you are located in the planet right now. Greetings to all participants. Thank you for participating in such an important event for us Indigenous peoples and local communities. We have been debating in different spaces in order to present to you these proposals. Therefore, we recognize the effort of the different drafting teams who have been working hard on the proposals that we have been sharing today in the past days. Indigenous people, we have been always calling for not only full participation, but we have emphasized that Indigenous peoples, the different decision-making processes, spaces should have a full and effective participation. As you know, the lands and territories we live in are our source of livelihood. We need to preserve and protect our natural resources. Therefore, we always ask parties to look at our proposals and take them into consideration. Thank you. Thank you, Benito, for that brief intervention, for the call on the full and effective participation of Indigenous people in different spaces. This is key for Indigenous people. Now we will give the floor to FILAC, Gabriel Muñoz, the Technical Secretary of FILAC, please. FILAC, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, dear Ramiro. Thank you for the analysis and the presentation on Target 21, which we believe it's key for the future of Indigenous people. As FILAC, we believe that the new framework will represent the future of Indigenous people, and not only peoples itself, but land and territories. Therefore, I would like to share with you some comments on Target 21. Article 25 of the UN Indigenous Rights Declaration stated that Indigenous people have the right to keep, preserve, and have its own spiritual connection with land, waters, and different resources that traditionally were only managed by them, and to take the responsibility, the liability of that management for future generations. Paragraph 5 of the report of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous People and the UN framework stated that that specific part of the declaration represents 85% of biodiversity of the planet. Indigenous people have shown that have been great guardians of nature and land. They have managed not only land but resources that have proved positive results for biodiversity to keep even peace, safe, international security. Full and effective Indigenous people's participation should include technical and financial resources is key. So we agree with you in the sense that we believe that this is a key target 21 for the specific equitable and effective participation, and again to respect their rights over land, territories, and resources as well by women, girls, and youth. I think that if we consider Article 25, previously stated, we could be reinforcing 21 by adding in between territories, waters, coastlines, lands, territories, and other resources. It is also linked with Target 3. And again, it is important to highlight the free, prior, and informed consent that should be changed in Targets 3 and 20. It could be confused, at least in the Spanish version of it, since those terms are not necessarily recognized by the ILO and the UN Declaration on Indigenous People. The right reference term to be used in Targets 13 and 20 as agreed language is free, prior, and informed consent. In Spanish, it uses a different term. It's not necessarily said informed as in English. Therefore, it's been asking for a review. And that terminology is being used, that language has been used in all different frameworks and agencies around the world. Therefore, we would like to highlight the fact of changing and looking at that specific language to be included warranty. And again, the financial resources that has to be provided for this specific goal. The future of Indigenous people, life, integrity, are all related to the different topics that we have been suggesting and discussing. Those are linked to biodiversity and land tenure and protection. Thank you, Chair. Gabriel, thank you. I think the comments that you share are quite important. First of all, concept, terminology, and language to be used, informed in Spanish. It is probably one of the first comments we were going through in the different working groups of the forum, the Indigenous International Forum, and that's and water's important, lands and knowledge. They're also important to be added in order to look for a consensus. I will give now the floor to Guatemala and then Mexico, please. Guatemala, Leticia Lopez.
Guatemala.
Guatemala, you have the floor. Go ahead, Sister Leticia, you have the floor. Can you? Yes, we can hear you. Great, go ahead. It's a real pleasure to greet you. Since yesterday I was trying to get through and make some comments because, sometimes we cannot express all the things we should contribute as Guatemala. First, I would like to congratulate you because the dialogue is very important, and it's important to have it global as this time. And after listening the proposals to keep this as global targets, I see with great concern that we are segmenting the vision of women, because if these are global targets, we need to set clearly there, because if we have separate targets, we are fostering a segmentation as a collective. So in this case, concretely, my contribution goes in the sense we would like to see this cross-cutting not only of traditional knowledge, because we know that this is important, and who are the people that were there in the concrete actions for transmission orally, generation to generation, are women. Most are the ones who own those knowledges. So to me, the position of Guatemala is I would like to ask you to make an effort to have a cross-cutting actions and not segmenting actions. And all the proposals that you have presented, well, we support them. When you talk about marine and coastal areas in the previous presentation, we couldn't take the floor at that time. We need to reinforce those knowledges. Where do they go? Only actions and strengthening. I think that we need something more concrete that will guarantee that there is some kind of rule from the state, from governments, to have the will to respect, the commitment to respect. So in general, this is what I can say, and I'm really happy to be able to take the floor from Guatemala. It was a pleasure to see you and to greet you. Thank you, Guatemala. What you mentioned is very important, the integrality and women participation within the processes, the use and management and conservation of the diversity and natural resources. Indigenous women have played a very important role, and also making sure this knowledge is transferred to new generations. So we will take note and we will integrate this. Thank you, Guatemala. Now Mexico has the floor, and then Chicho. Go ahead, Mexico. Thank you. Good morning, good evening, good night. Thank you that you give the floor to Mexico. Again, for us, it is very important to express our support regarding different opinions and perspectives of representatives of indigenous peoples and local communities have done with this target. We would like to emphasize that it is important to mention the participation has to be full and effective, as it was mentioned. But we believe that it's relevant to mention in this target this aspect. We would like to mention as well that on top of the acknowledgement of the right on lands and territories, to mention human rights, to emphasize that, not to see it in a fragmented way, as it was mentioned before, but as we have done in the whole framework, to have a cross-cutting perspective on human rights. This is very important because it will acknowledge the right of a healthy environment, and this is part of other rights to health, to children, kids, young people, women. So we would like it to have it mentioned in this target, the acknowledgement of human rights. Thank you. Yes, we will take note. Thank you, Mexico. The team is taking notes, because all the things you are mentioning are very important. Everything that is related to the full in participation, as it was mentioned here. So thank you for all the comments and all the things that will make the proposal richer coming from the forum, and also the targets we will be able to move forward. So John, you have the floor now, and then we have yes.
Thank you, Ramiro. Just one observation or comment is with all the suggestions that are being made, proposals for text changes and whatnot by Indigenous peoples, IPLCs, is that I go back to the transformative change that needs to happen. And while IPLCs, Indigenous peoples, women, youth, and so forth are welcoming changes to be a part of this process, I think it's not to join the status quo. It's to look at how institutions within governments and within countries also need to transform their processes to address and to accommodate these changes that are being suggested by Indigenous peoples. If those changes don't happen, we can suggest things, but they may not be respected or taken up by a country or by institutions. Institutions also have to make those changes to accommodate different ways of respecting biodiversity and making it more sustainable and equitable. So I think there's a important role by institutions, be they of government, academia, and so forth, that need to look at those changes as well within themselves. Thank you.
Gracias, John. Fundamental.
Thank you, John. Yes, it is very important. So we will take note to move forward. So Martinez, you have the floor. ILO.
Labor Organization on the occasion of World Day of Indigenous Peoples. This is the day where we thank Indigenous peoples for their contributions, their important contributions to inclusive and sustainable development and to humanity indeed. The words, the remarks that we wanted to make relate very much also to what the previous speaker has said and to what several previous speakers have said, that the rights to land and natural resources and the rights to effective participation in decision-making are indeed two sides of the same coin. They go together and they cannot be disassociated from each other. Both the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also ILO Convention 169 provide strong guarantees around these collective rights. And they are really the fundament on which also the implementation of the proposed target 21 can be brought forward. In this sense, it's very interesting and important to note that the United Nations Chief Executive Board for Coordination, that brings together the head of all United Nations organizations, has last November adopted a call for action of partnerships with Indigenous peoples towards inclusive and sustainable development. And in this call for action, participation in decision-making is particularly highlighted, and the United Nations system, which includes the ILO but also others, is requested to assist and to work with governments around the world to improve mechanisms and institutional and legal frameworks for participation. From our own experience in monitoring the implementation of Convention 169, and particularly, of course, in Latin America, where it is already widely ratified, we are seeing that state institutions need to be strengthened and transformed to really bring these rights to life. And we have seen that, particularly in countries that have a designated lead agency with a cross-cutting responsibility, also to coordinate across between different government entities, and that can work towards a whole of government approach, that those countries have advanced more in establishing those mechanisms, those spaces for consultation and participation. And that will be very much needed. And we look forward to collaborating with all interested parties with regard to better implementing the rights, the collective rights to participation, consultation, and also the rights to land and natural resources. In this sense, we are very supportive of this and look forward to seeing this discussion going forward. Thank you very much, Chair.
Agradecemos a OIT por...
Thank you, ILO, for your intervention, for your comments. And it is important to see all the comments from the ILO from the Convention 169, as was mentioned, one of the tools in the acknowledgement of the rights of indigenous peoples and how to make it compatible with the targets. This is going to be essential to go on with the dialogue. It's going to be a key issue. So now let's give the floor to our sister Betty. Betty, you have the floor, and then we have Roxana. So, Betty, you have the floor. Betty?
In the device settings, please press on mic and allow the device that you are using now.
Le damos la palabra a Roxana y luego...
So we will give the floor to Roxana while Betty is checking her equipment. Is that okay? Great. So Roxana, you have the floor. So the network of young people, LAC. Roxana, please, to the left, upside, device settings. Okay, perfect. There you are. Go ahead, Roxana. You have to click on mic to take the floor. Good morning, everyone. Basically, Target 21, I wanted to highlight or emphasize that we lost the sound. We lost the sound. Yes, now, yes, we can hear you now. Yes? Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead. Can you hear me? Yes, we do. Go ahead. Okay. Well, basically, I wanted to highlight where you mentioned to respect the rights over lands and territories and resources. It would be good to highlight this topic and to mention to give access to the lands, territories, and resources to indigenous peoples and local communities, because due to expansions, due to agriculture, and many communities and many peoples have been displaced by the system. So it is essential to me to guarantee the participation is to give access, to guarantee that they will have access to the lands, territories, and resources. So this is what I wanted to highlight here. So to guarantee the access to lands, territories, and resources to continue with the functions we have. We have that right, to guarantee that right, that we have access to the land. And in many sectors in Latin America, they have been displaced. Some are prosecuted. There are mafias. So it's essential then to be able to guarantee that access. And in some sectors, well, that they are marginalized. So that's why I think it is important that we need to mention to guarantee the access, to respect the rights, to preserve, to be able to preserve the land, the territories, like all together, and to have all that knowledge. And so if you don't have access to the land, you won't be able to preserve or to guarantee and even to allow the survival of the people. Yes, thank you, sister. It is very important. The participation of men, women, young people is essential right now, because here we are talking about target post-2020. And the young people are the ones that are going to live under the target. So I would like to close here, and I'm going to ask Abby. Abby, can you make the final comments on the topic, please?
Is my audio okay?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much to Yes, all right. Thank you so much to all who have intervened and shared their thoughts. So definitely all of these are very important in our discussions in this target. I can't respond to all, but maybe it's important to note that these are so far the extent of the discussions and position of the IFB, but definitely as there will be further developments in the discussion of the post-2020, we will have to review our position as this process goes on. So definitely the issue on fragmentation and segmentation of the points we would like to raise, such as a human rights-based approach, is something we are all looking to how we can reflect it better. So we will take this into account in the IFB discussions, and definitely there is much more to work on. We haven't touched yet on sections H to K and even the indicators framework, where they may also be important. So that's it, and thank you.
Gracias, Abigail. Gracias.
Thank you, Abigail, for being in this working group and having the proposals. Well, we have no longer the right to take the floor. Thank you, delegates, parties, observers, for your comments and suggestions. I would like to open item 8 related to the remaining targets in the first draft of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Well, this item aims to give participants in the dialogue the opportunity to consider other targets relevant to indigenous peoples and local communities that have not been addressed in previous items. So due to time constraints, participants are invited to focus on specific comments and proposals and their interventions. So I will invite Jennifer Tauli Corpus, part of NIATERO, to make a brief introductory presentation on the subject. Please, Jenny.
So I will be presenting the IIFB analysis and proposals on the provisions on the targets and goals related to access and benefit sharing, climate change, and biosafety. Next slide, please. The key message: access and benefit sharing is the third objective of the convention, and it took 18 years from the adoption of the CBD for the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol to take place. It took 22 years before the Nagoya Protocol entered into force, and this really needs implementation. So we are pleased that the focus of Goal C is on increasing benefit sharing, and it includes recognition of indigenous peoples and local communities, who are holding traditional knowledge. So we recall that Aichi Biodiversity Target 16 had two elements, that the Nagoya Protocol should be enforced and that it should be operational. This is one of the targets in the Aichi targets that was partially achieved. So it is enforced now, and it is on its way to becoming operational. The major gap that was identified is that there is very little benefit sharing, and no significant benefits have been flowing to Indigenous peoples. So as I said, focus of Goal C on benefit sharing is welcome. We also welcome the inclusion of associated traditional knowledge in Target 13, and we make the observation that there should be a similar reflection of ATK in Goal C. Now for the additional suggestions. The restriction of benefit sharing to genetic resources and associated TK has not ensured benefits that were envisaged in the Nagoya Protocol, and this needs to be revisited. We refer in particular to the discussions on DSI and the major missed opportunity of not including DSI in Goal C and Target 13. Non-inclusion of derivatives, which we consider to include DSI, would fundamentally undermine the objective of ABS. Okay, next slide, please. Now we go to the specific targets, the goals first. Now, Goal C has a few elements. First is that benefits from the utilization of GRs are shared fairly and equitably, and we agree with this element. And we note that under the Nagoya Protocol, under certain circumstances, Indigenous peoples have authority to grant or withhold access to genetic resources and have the right to benefit from the same. We also welcome the element of a substantial increase in both monetary and non-monetary benefits, and of course also the last element. As I mentioned in the introduction, what is missing here is the concept of derivatives, so that we make sure that we are not undermining the Nagoya Protocol and the third objective of the convention. And as I also previously mentioned, ATK should likewise be reflected in Goal C, so that it reflects Target 13. Then we move to the milestones. The first milestone identifies monetary benefits. And this is welcome because it particularly includes holders of traditional knowledge. However, we recall that this terminology was extensively debated during the negotiations leading to the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol. And we would offer alternative language, which is found in Article 5.5 of the Nagoya Protocol. And the issue here is that in some instances, holders of traditional knowledge have not come by the TK legitimately. So we note that there are some repositories of traditional knowledge that have obtained such knowledge without free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. Therefore, the proposal is to reflect the wording of Article 5.5, which states Indigenous peoples and local communities holding traditional knowledge. And this applies also to milestone C.2. Next slide, please. We also welcome the specific mention of non-monetary benefits. Now, we recognize that the proposal here is quite long, and we would welcome any help to streamline the language. Okay, so the analysis is this. Non-monetary benefits are certainly welcome. However, we would like to note that participation of providers, including Indigenous peoples, in research and development should be a given whenever their genetic resources or knowledge is being accessed. Okay. Now we had an exercise to reflect on what the most important non-monetary benefit is for Indigenous peoples, and we identified the protection, preservation, and maintenance of traditional knowledge as the most important non-monetary benefit for Indigenous peoples. Therefore, we would like to include this terminology, which is found in Article 8J, the protection, preservation, and maintenance of traditional knowledge, in addition to participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities holding traditional knowledge in research and development. Now, this should be contained in the mutually agreed terms, which should be guided by community protocols, which is also language found in the Nagoya Protocol. Next slide, please. This makes my explanation of Target 13 a little bit easier, but let me first present our analysis of the specific elements of the target. Okay. The first element, which is the implementation of measures at the global level and in all countries to facilitate access to genetic resources, recognize that Indigenous also have authority to grant or withhold access to genetic resources. The next element, which is the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of the resources, we agree with it, and also the sharing of benefits from the use of associated traditional knowledge. Now, the last element, which is through mutually agreed terms and prior and informed consent, we note that the Motzkushtal guidelines recognizes that prior and informed consent also includes free, prior, and informed consent. Okay, and the proposal for text changes is fairly straightforward, and it is just to add derivatives after genetic resources. Next slide, please. And on Target 8, we welcome in Target 8, the linking of biodiversity and climate change. And also, we think that the new target is using the correct terminology, which is ecosystem-based approaches. Now we have a very small addition towards the end. Before I proceed there, the reason why we welcome ecosystem-based approaches is because embedded in the definition of this approach is the requirement that these approaches contribute to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So it cannot just be any approach that contributes to mitigation, but it must not have adverse effects on biodiversity. Okay, and we had a small addition towards the end of the paragraph because we note that the burden should not be put all on Indigenous peoples and local communities, because we are seeing that many of the efforts to mitigate are targeting forest areas where most Indigenous peoples, plenty of Indigenous peoples can be found. So the contribution of forests to climate change mitigation should not be the only way to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. Therefore, the burdens should be shared. There should also be efforts to reduce emissions at source. And of course, once benefits are generated from these ecosystem-based approaches, the benefits should be shared equitably. And then finally, the last target, next slide please, is on biosafety. So the recommendation here is fairly straightforward again, and it references the guidance that the Cartagena Protocol has developed on socio-economic considerations. So we agree with the sense of the target, the thrust of the target, which is to manage, control potential adverse impacts of biotechnology on biodiversity and human health, but it's also important to take into account cultural and socio-economic considerations, as already agreed by the parties. And this ends my presentation. Of course, there are other targets, but we have not included them here, but we may include them as we engage in the open-ended working group discussions. So this was the group that worked on the proposals. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair.
Gracias, Jenny. Un trabajo.
Thank you, Jenny. Such a great job while reviewing the different goals related to Indigenous peoples and where we can provide some input. Thank you. Before opening the plenary session, I would also like to remind you again that the interventions have a maximum duration of 3 minutes. Please press the raise your hand button to request the floor, to share your thoughts and opinions. Now I open the plenary. It is important to get used to the platform since we'll be using this platform for other events and sessions. That's where we need to get used to have a more active participation. So now I will give the floor to Mexico. Valeria Cruz, please go ahead. You have the floor. Thank you. I think now you can see me. Not now, but yes, now we can. Thank you. We were waiting for the plenary session. We were waiting for participants to take the floor, but since nobody would like to mention something, we would like to intervene. Could we go to target 8? Thanks. For us, we can support target 8 proposal since we believe that Mexico is also looking at this specific ecosystem-based approach. As you have highlighted here, we cannot just leave nature all the responsibility. We need to all different sectors, stakeholders at different levels work hard on mitigation, which is probably the one specifically stated in this target. We have presented our opinions in our several contributions to the national level, at least here in Mexico, we have done so. And those will be the specific proposals in targets we're reflecting on. So we agree on your proposed text. If we could move to target or we could also be looking at goal C. Goal C on derivatives, the suggestion on derivatives of goal C. It is important to have a coherent document and also to look at always considering the same language, free, prior, informed consent. You mentioned it. I think Mexico is always having the position of having a definition, a sort of glossary that will be covered. But for us, it is important to keep on adding the 3 adjectives for consent, right? Free, prior, and informed consent, and that's been already agreed. So we will be supporting also that additional, especially in relation to associated traditional knowledge and goal C as well. on target 17, I think. Will that be the last one? I guess it is. Thank you. In several cases, we have been highlighting how important cultural and biocultural aspects are so important for Mexico, especially related to language preservation. And I don't know whether somebody else would like to add something on this specific topic. Since today we're commemorating a special day, I would like to share something in. And I will speak in Nahuatl. I don't think the interpreters will be able to understand me, but I will read it out loud with all due respect to all of you in Nahuatl.
El canto del cenzontle. Nehuatl, Nicatzontlan, Incha, Chihuitl, Istlapalitz. Yo amo el color del jade.
I love jade color. And the smell of flowers. And also my brother, the human. I love him and I love you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely poem you share with us, which shows the connection between communities. Our language is so rich. Thanks for your observation and comments and support on the several goals that we will take also into consideration. We will now give the floor to Mirna. Mirna, you have the floor. I think she's having some issues, some technical issues to open the mic. Nimal. Nimal, you have the floor.
Him, and podemos volver a escuchar después con.
Maybe we can come back to Nimal co-share. Maybe we can try to help him first with the technical issues. Co-chair, maybe we can invite somebody else. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Get back connection, and we kept on repeating it. Internet connection has become a limitation for many of the indigenous community representatives. Since we are not living in big cities, we are living in our communities, and connection is not always so strong over here. We would like to ask speakers, participants, observers, parties to please raise your hand if you want to take the floor.
To raise their hand and if he wishes to take the floor.
Okay. Por favor, adelante.
Please, Nimal. I think we have the technical secretary of Philip raising her hand. Thank you, co-chair. Since nobody else would like to take the floor, I will intervene. First of all, thanks for this thorough analysis on several of the goals that have been presented, and thank you for the proposals as well. On Target 17, the one we're looking at right now on the screen, I just want to highlight the importance of, just as a brief comment, the importance of reinforcing in each of the parties to reinforce the national dialogues towards COP25, and in order to strengthen and socialize all these different proposed targets that they have been working on that will be considered in the COP15. From FILAC, we noticed there's just few communication channels or ways of communicating this specific target to local communities. So from now onwards and towards the COP15, that's something that we should consider. And I think it is in the hands of the governments, but also on indigenous people's hands and allies and partners, because if we are not aware of this type of targets and work, and we do not work together with indigenous communities and local communities, this becomes more an elite sort of practice. Conservation, preservation is in the lands and territories of indigenous people and local communities. Therefore, I think it is important to keep on thinking on how to widespread the word, how to go directly to them and talk about these targets to them. I would also like to make a further recommendation. We are getting into the decade of the indigenous language. In Latin America, we have created an Indigenous Language Institute in the last summit a month ago. Therefore, especially socialization of this sort of topics have to be guaranteed the use of indigenous languages. And that's so important, since lots of the different topics that we are discussing here in a very technical level, a high level discussion. Thank you for translation. Thank you for the interpretation. But when we go directly to talk to indigenous communities, we need to use their languages. It is so important to make an extra effort so that these people actually understand what we are referring to, what we're talking about. We're talking about full and effective participation, and that does include the use of their traditional and indigenous languages. Thank you. Thank you. Co-chair. Thank you. We would like to give the floor to Maria Costa, please. Maria Costa, you have the floor. Mary, on the left upper part, you have the settings, the audio settings, and you can check the mic you have used, please. You can select the mic that you have to use. Yeah. On the right side, the upper part, there. Yes. Please, Mari, you have the floor. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you. Thank you, Co-Chair, for the opportunity to talk to this plenary. I would just want to share a comment with all of you. And this is a specific comment. I just want to highlight the fact that we are the holders of traditional knowledge. and biological resources holders as well. It is important to recognize the relation between the spiritual and material world. So the access and use of those resources should not be divided. Both are intertwined and are connected to the ecosystem and the spiritual world. Therefore, the community protocols are quite important tools since they show the respect of the cultural and traditional practice of the local communities. And thus contribute to the sustainable development of the different ecosystems. It also helps to support and organize work and life in the different ecosystems. Those have been already recognized in international human rights of indigenous peoples. We collectively own those rights, which are indispensable for the existence and well-being and integral development of our people. It is also of highly importance that indigenous governance respects the full and effective participation in everything related to the life of indigenous people. If the community, land, territories, resources, where indigenous women has played an important role along all the different processes of knowledge transfer, traditional medicine, food, nutrition, culture. Women have been the ones spreading that knowledge in generations. Therefore, I just want to mention that our customary law, the respect of our rights on resources, traditional knowledge, use and distribution, and access and benefit sharing. I think we are cutting a part of our ecosystem. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your participation and your comments. We'll give the floor to Guatemala.
¿Logran escucharme?
Can you hear me? Yes, we do. Go ahead. Yes, Leti. Thank you very much. Once again, it's a great pleasure to be able to be here and to share with you. And my comment is regarding the ecosystems. When we are talking about ecosystemic approaches, we were talking about that lately in the institution. What are the dimensions we need to take into account from the theory, understand why we do have to start to work with this ecosystemic approach? The political part is so important because the dialogues we are having here will need a political side where authorities and all the entities will be able to approve and be able to allow those the implementation of the targets. And what we see from the proposals here, three important approaches that we need to take into account. First, the rights. When we start to be associated with ecosystemic resources, we are talking as people that we have rights to the benefits that come from those ecosystemic resources. The gender focus, that is going to give us this general image of identifying where are the lack of equity, these inequitable distributions. What do we have to do to be able to have more equity of resources coming from nature? So that on one side, and well, this has been like the core of the discussion, because we know that each people's, well, everyone has its own relevance. It is important not to leave aside those three approaches. I would like to remind you that they are established from the people's cosmovision. All the things that coexist, or all the things we have around us is alive. So we cannot see it as something that is not connected regarding the maintenance, the conservation, and of course, to be able to benefit from that. But all those benefits need to be done through responsible actions. We have to foster that part of co-responsibility. We have the right to benefit, but we have a big responsibility. And I'm going to take a sentence that was mentioned by Ramiro Batzin in one of his presentations. We are part of the solution. We have the solution from our small environments, but those actions or solutions that we want to transform them in affirmative actions, well, that's what we have to do. Let's see those commitments that sometimes seem to be very little, but are essential for the conservation and sustainable use of resources of biodiversity. Thank you very much. Thank you, Guatemala. Thank you, Leti, for your intervention. It is important to see how Guatemala has made some progress on the topic, on the issue. Now, Soledad has the floor. Thank you very much, co-chair. The climate change and the benefit share are important for people of the sea, men and women that live in the coastal areas, fishermen and fisherwomen. And regarding this global framework that is asking for marine conservation, it is important to see the impact on the coastal and marine people, the effects of climate change. And we need to guarantee that the information discussed in the Commission should be shared in a transparent and clear way. So there is no information in the sectors. So the small fishermen and fisherwomen, they need to be present in next COP, and it has to be clear and transparent, and to reach a consensus with other sectors that are so important, and things that we have discussed regarding implications, and namely the topics that were discussed in the last part of the session, the impact on their lives. So the need to have these sectors I mentioned to be part of the discussions. Thank you. A last intervention. Andis, please. We need to close within 10 minutes. So go ahead, please. Can you hear me? Yes. My intervention here is to remind us that the implementation of Nagoya Protocol with this share of benefits, monetary and non-monetary, will depend in most of the cases of the political will and decision of the states. We have talked about the importance of having frameworks for the access and share of benefits, and this is a task that was not able to be done. That's why for Indigenous peoples and local communities, biocultural protocols are important. This is another pending task. We need to continue working on that because biocommerce, so the access to our resources, our traditional knowledge will continue. And I would also like to say that when we talk about participation, the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples, we need to highlight again the inclusion of women and young people. And finally, there is a visibility of the participation of women in CBD. That's why we have a gender plan. Regarding derivatives, we need to take into account all the new biotechnology and synthetic technology, digital sequencing, etc. So, well, thank you. Thank you for your intervention. Thank you all the delegates of the parts, Indigenous peoples and observers for their comments and suggestions. Let's continue now to closure our event. I would like to thank the group for the observations and comments, and I would like to invite Mr. Basile, co-chair of the open-ended working group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, to provide the closing remarks. So please, Mr. Basile, you have the floor.
Can you hear me well? ¿Me escuchas bien?
Le escuchamos.
Gracias. It's a pleasure to join you, Glenn, and I've joined about an hour ago, and I've listened very carefully to your comments. And I wish I would have time to be with you for the duration. What is important for Francis and I is to hear your views, not only on your addition to the text, but also the text that is important to you and the one that you felt was appropriate. I think I have a couple messages for you to think about in terms of strategy and how you want to intervene in the discussion. The notion, for example, one I've noticed is this notion of socioculturally appropriate matter. We may want to have it in the appropriate target, but perhaps it's useful to put it in the preambular text. And that may lead to a simpler formulation and something that is perhaps more effective. On the second point, in terms of, I heard quite a bit of discussion about Target 8 and the on climate change, and particularly on the notion of an equitable sharing of the burden and the opportunities. I think that's a very fundamental point. The proposal that you've provided is very interesting. I think we may want to look at how you position the language in the target itself so it reflects on the totality of the target, not just the last part of the target. So those are only 2 points that I've gathered through your discussion. There is many other notes that I have in my book. Keep in mind, though, that really you gotta, the important people to talk to are the parties at this point. In a sense, Francis and I have done an important part of our work, and now we're in listening mode to the parties to hear what they want, what the stakeholder wants, and what mandate they will give us for the next step. We're happy to work in whatever ways you will tell us to work. It's going to be important to make the best of the 2 weeks ahead of us and try to think on how we can use the time ahead of us all the way to January, where hopefully I'll be able to meet with you face to face and shake your hands. So This has been a very useful conversation, albeit very short for myself. I'm looking forward to the result and the outcome of this meeting. I'm sure I'll be in touch with CAPAC regularly over the coming weeks and months, and I'm looking forward to meet with you. So thank you very much, and thank you for your work.
Gracias, señor Jabre.
Thank you, and thank you for your words, and thank you also for creating the conditions. Distinguished participants, I would like to thank my co-chair and the participants and my co-chair Lucy Mulenki for all that excellent work during these 3 days. Their work made possible a coordination at a global level. I would like to thank the rapporteurs, their excellent work. I would like to thank as well co-chairs of the working group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We are confident that under your work and leadership, we will arrive to good port. I would like to thank the Secretariat. I would like to thank the interpreters. Without them, we wouldn't be able to communicate. And as it is traditional, we are going to close the session with a spiritual ceremony with our Tata Felix Sarasua. And I would like to thank the rapporteur for his participation and being with us and the time he has devoted so that we could discuss all the things we discussed here. So Tata, go ahead. Yes, Tata, go ahead. We are here. Well, good morning. Yes, go ahead. We can hear you. Thank you. Good morning. So, I am Amma Chaquichicler from the Chimaltenango in Guatemala. Thank you for this opportunity and for giving me the space, also for the elders. And we are going to thank the activity that is ending today. In the Mayan time, today is a Chi Day. Chi is the coyote, the alter ego. It's all the canines. But the energy and the philosophy, the Mayan cosmovision, the energetic part is also representing something special. Chi is the secretary, the one who takes note of all the things that we do, all the actions and all our attitudes, and all the things that were discussed, all the topics that were dealt with. So what everybody said are commitments to life, to Mother Earth, to the world. And Grandfather T is taking note of all that. And Grandfather T also talks about fidelity to our principles, to all the things we say and express through the word actions. So we really have to agree what we do. So it has to be in balanced, and we need to agree ourselves with that. And it is important. And I would like to end up with the Grandfather C, so that all the things we discussed, all the agreements we reached, our ancestors will guide us so that they can materialize our dreams, our hopes. And that's the role of Grandfather C. So I will allow the permission of the authorities, and please connect your heart, your mind, your spirit to thank the space the universe has given us.
Abuelos y abuelas, con ya con sencillez, especialmente al abuelo, pedir, suplicar, que sea nuestro mensajero nuestro intérprete guiador ante el creador y formador del universo, para que eleve nuestro agradecimiento profundo del espacio que nos ha permitido, del tiempo que se nos ha permitido en estos diálogos. Pedido y suplicar entonces que los acuerdos, que todo lo expresado son sueños, son ilusiones tal vez, o es la experiencia de cada quien puedan materializarse. ¿Para qué? Para el beneficio de todos y todas. Pero el beneficio de todas y todas no solo nos beneficia a los seres humanos, a todo aquel elemento que está en la madre tierra, que está en el universo, para que todos estén bien, todos tengamos una convivencia pacífica, para poder mantener ese equilibrio que es necesario, no solo en nuestro interior, ese equilibrio entre nuestras acciones y nuestros pensamientos, sino ese equilibrio en nuestra relación con la madre tierra, con las montañas, con los barrancos, con las cuevas, con los animales, con los pájaros, con todas las plantas. Es mantener ese equilibrio en la relación con cada elemento en el universo, con la abuela luna, con el abuelo sol, con las estrellas, con las constelaciones. Todo es necesario aún. Hagan el favor, pues, entonces, abuela, sí, elevar nuestro agradecimiento al Pushkasto, por este espacio que se nos permite. Con permiso, pues, abuelos y abuelas, infinitas gracias. Todos en su corazón y en su pensamiento, dado en su espíritu, queden con alegría, queden con felicidad, satisfechos de los logros alcanzados. Igualmente ustedes reciban toda su candela, también para que ustedes también estén felices, contentos por todo. Muchas gracias a todos y todas.
Thank you to you all. Thank you, Tata. Thank you to all for your participation. I wish you, your communities and your families and peoples safe and please, think about biosecurity protocols. So now I call this meeting to an end.